In the early morning of one day in late February of 2000, Australian police would receive a call. The call came from a worried coworker of one John Price, who failed to show up to work that morning. John's boss was getting worried sick as this was unusual for him, so he sent one of his coworkers to check up on him. When cops arrived, there were noticeable blood marks on the front door, so they soon entered the house. As they began exploring the home, they witnessed some of the worst things a human being could do to another. John's lifeless body was slouched over on the floor next to an unresponsive woman. The woman was Katherine Knight. John's body was in a weird position with an arm holding a 2-liter soda bottle and his legs crossed. On the archway of the living room entrance hung something extremely odd. The police noticed it was hardening and covered in blood. Turns out it was John's skin. He was skinned at some point during the previous night. The police then ventured further into the house, heading into the kitchen. In one of the heated pots was John's decapitated head, mixed with various vegetables and sauces. There was also unknown meat in the oven. On the dining room tables lay multiple plates with the names of each of John's children seemingly assigned to them. But first, let's back up a bit to see how all this happened.
Bag up, bag up. Bag up, Terry. Put it in reverse, Terry. Put it in reverse.
Katherine Knight was born in an extremely dysfunctional family back in the mid-1950s. Her mother had an affair with another man while she was married, leaving her husband. The new man she was seeing was Ken Knight, and Katherine would soon be born. Katherine had a twin sister and other siblings. Her father, unfortunately, was an alcoholic and would often abuse her mother. Katherine was also abused by other members of her family until the age of 11. Growing up in school, she was described as a loner and a bully at times when she found herself in a rage. She assaulted a kid she went to school with, as well as one of her teachers. Though strangely, she was also a good kid sometimes who received praise and was seen as a model student. Katherine was never close to many people growing up, as it was noted that she was only really close to her twin sister and her uncle. When her uncle committed back in 1969, it absolutely devastated her. She even began saying his ghost would visit her at various times throughout the day. Katherine left school altogether at just 15 years old, picking up a job at an abattoir, also known as a slaughterhouse. She would cut up meat and was given a set of butcher knives, which she kept hanging above her bed at home. All of these things in her life at a relatively young age definitely contributed to the type of person she would become later in her life. Katherine had a long history of abusing the men she dated and even married throughout her life. David Kellett, a coworker of Katherine when she was 18, would be her first victim of abuse. The two grew close and started a relationship soon after meeting. When David found himself in a fight, Katherine would back him up and threaten those who did anything to upset her. Upon meeting Barbara, Katherine's mother, David said that she warned him not to mess with Katherine. Quote, "You better watch this one or she'll fucking kill you. Stir her up the wrong way or do the wrong thing and you're fucked." Even her own mother knew what Katherine was capable of. The two would eventually get married, which immediately turned bad. On the night of their wedding, Katherine tried to strangle David. The reasoning was apparently because David fell asleep after they had boarded the beef bus 3 times, if you know what I mean. The marriage would only continue to be violent and abusive. Katherine burned all of David's clothing before she would hit him on the back of the head with a frying pan, because he got home late from a darts tournament which he ended up getting into the finals of. David was obviously terrified and scared for his own life, so he tried to get out of the house, but he soon collapsed, being heavily disoriented after taking a blow to the back of his head. However, he did make it to the neighbor's house before he passed out. He was taken to the hospital and treated for a severely fractured skull. Police were ready to charge Katherine, though after she persuaded David, he ultimately dropped all charges against her. Later, after the birth of the couple's first daughter, Melissa, David left Katherine because he couldn't put up with the abuse anymore. The day after, Katherine was seen on a public street violently rocking and pushing the pram holding her daughter. This caused concern and she was taken to a hospital where she was diagnosed with postnatal depression. After her recovery, she immediately went and placed her daughter Melissa, who was only 2 months at the time, on a railway track soon before a train would be coming. She then left her daughter and went straight into town wielding an axe, threatening multiple people on the street. Thankfully, a man who happened to be nearby found Melissa and saved her right before the train arrived. Katherine was arrested and taken back to the hospital for recovery, which lasted a grand total of 1 day. Just a few days after this, Katherine slashed a woman's face and made the woman drive her to the town in which David lived. The woman escaped after a stop, and Katherine soon took a random boy hostage, but thankfully was disarmed shortly by police. She was once again admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Police called David to tell him of Katherine's plan to find him and kill both him and his mother. He then came back to support Katherine, noticing an obvious mental decline. It seemed to go slightly better for the two, though Katherine would eventually leave David. Another relationship Katherine had also involved more assault and abuse in was one involving David Saunders. She got extremely jealous when he was not around and would throw him out, sometimes cutting up his clothes afterwards. Katherine set a deranged example of what she would do if David ever cheated by slicing the throat of one of his dingo puppies in front of his own eyes. For no reason at all, she would then hit him on the back of the head with a frying pan, much like what she did in her last relationship. This isn't all though, as just in the next couple years, after they had a daughter, Katherine stabbed David with scissors in the stomach and hit him in the face with an iron tool. He finally had enough and went into hiding, fearing for his life. Friends of David covered for him and never gave up his location when Katherine would come asking for him. A few months later, he returned solely to see his daughter, but he would receive unexpected news. Katherine had told the police that she was the one afraid of him and what he did to her, so they issued something called an apprehended violence order, which I think is like an Australian version of a restraining order. The two would finally stop seeing each other soon after this. Katherine met John Price, a father and a person loved by many in the community, when she started an affair with him while in another relationship. John would invite Katherine over to his house where she met his children, and they loved her. John soon learned of her disturbing and violent past, but continued to see her, and she eventually moved in with him and the kids. John was making good money working in the nearby mines, and Katherine further bonded with his kids. It seemed to be going relatively well, ignoring some arguments every now and then. Katherine wanted John to marry her, but John wasn't too excited about that idea. This upset her, and in some kind of act of retaliation, she recorded various objects he had apparently stolen from his work and sent the video to his boss. Even though the objects were just things he had taken from open and out-of-date medical kits and garbage cans, his boss still fired him. When John found out it was Katherine who had caused all of this, he kicked her out. Months later, after their relationship basically ended, John wanted to try things again with her, but drew a line. She wasn't allowed to move in with him. Unfortunately, the arguments and fighting escalated and became more common for the two. John received advice from worried friends, clearly disturbed after learning what she had done in the past, but he wouldn't listen and lost friends along the way. In February of 2000, Katherine would assault John many times, mostly involving stabbings in his chest. He obviously would go on to kick her out. He filed a restraining order on February 28th, hoping to keep both him and his children safe. When John went to work later that day, he told friends and coworkers that if he failed to show up to work tomorrow, it was Katherine. They were understandably worried about him, pleading with him not to go home. But in the end, he would still decide to return home. He was surprised to find Katherine waiting for him. She told John that she had sent his kids over to a friend's house for a sleepover that night. He then went to hang out with some friends at his neighbor's house before returning home around 11 p.m. Earlier that day, Katherine had recorded all of her children while speaking about random things in her life, which seemed to be some kind of will. Returning back to that night, John and Katherine would do the hokey pokey under the sheets, if you know what I mean. Afterwards, he would fall asleep. Katherine would stab John with a butcher's knife while he was still sleeping. He woke up in an obvious panic and tried to escape. He tried to run away, moving throughout the house, but Katherine followed and chased him. He barely got outside, but Katherine must have grabbed him and dragged him back inside towards the hallway, where he later died from the blatant injury he had sustained. He was stabbed a total of 37 times throughout the night. Katherine left the house, heading to a nearby ATM to withdraw $1,000 from John's bank account. She then returned home after, where she would skin him and leave all of it on a meat hook hanging above the living room entrance. She would then decapitate John and cook various parts of his body, mixing them with vegetables like zucchini, cabbage, carrots, and baked potato with some gravy. Katherine then prepared the kitchen tables with handwritten notes next to each plate she laid out, with the name of John's kids on each. You can probably guess what she was planning to do without me even saying it, but yeah, she was going to feed those kids their own father. For some reason, there was another plate prepared in the back garden of his house, which some theorize was meant for Katherine to eat, though she couldn't get it down. John's head was in a pot, which she turned on to a little over 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. Katherine then positioned John's body, which was sitting on the hallway floor, with his left arm hanging over an empty soda bottle. She also made sure his legs were crossed. She wrote a note on a photo of John, which she left on his body. The note is just graphic ramblings of what was later to be found as baseless accusations. It just involved mentioning John doing things to her children and even his own kids, which again was completely made up. Katherine, at some point after leaving the note, would overdose on pills, leaving her comatose next to John's body. Later the next morning, after receiving a call from John's coworker and friend, the police would enter and find everything she had done. In court, it was apparent that Katherine was clearly unhinged. She showed no remorse for anything she had done, even after pleading guilty. The judge, Barry O'Keefe, mentioned how performing such a disturbing and cruel crime without feeling any remorse whatsoever deserved an extreme and severe punishment. Katherine was sentenced to life without parole, which was the country's first. When Katherine appealed the decision, the response was a resounding no because of how foul and disgusting her crime was. Fast forwarding to today, Katherine Knight is still alive, serving her life sentence in prison, unable to cause further harm to those who are unfortunate enough to step foot in her path.